I want to start with a discrepancy. Not a revelation, not a smoking gun, a discrepancy in a navigation log, May 12th, 1926. The airship Norge is crossing the Arctic Ocean at approximately 90 degrees north latitude. On board, Roald Amundsen, Umberto Nobile, Lincoln Ellsworth, and a crew of 15. This is the first verified crossing of the North Pole by any aircraft. Verified is the key word. Robert Peary had claimed to reach it on foot in 1909. Frederick Cook had claimed the same in 1908. The controversy between them consumed a decade of public attention and produced, as the historian Bo Riffenberg carefully documents, no definitive proof from either man. The Norge crosses the pole in the air. It is witnessed. It is photographed. It is documented. And the navigator, Hjalmar Riise-Larsen, writes in the official log that at the precise moment of crossing, all 3 magnetic compasses aboard the airship ceased to function reliably. That detail appears in the historical record. It is not controversial. Compasses behave strangely near the magnetic North Pole. Everyone knows this. The official explanation is satisfying, and I believed it for a long time. Here is the part I didn't expect to find. The degree to which compasses fail near the pole is not what's strange. What's strange is how they fail. Not randomly, not with the unpredictable drift you'd expect from a weakening magnetic field. They fail in a consistent pattern. A repeating error that multiple expedition logs across different expeditions, different decades, different instrument generations describe in almost identical language. Not confusion, orientation, as if the compass isn't lost, as if it's pointing at something the instruments aren't supposed to find. I'm a skeptic. I want to be clear about that. I came to this looking for the physics explanation, the one that makes the whole thing boring and obvious. It didn't arrive. The deeper I went, the more the pattern held. And the pattern pointed somewhere that the official framing of the Arctic has spent considerable energy pointing away from. This is not a story about what's at the North Pole. I don't know what's there. I'm not going to claim that I do. This is a story about why the question of what's there is one that major institutions, major governments, and the literature they produce consistently decline to examine fully. And what it tells us that they don't. We are told the Arctic is understood. We are told the North Pole is a location, a coordinate, a geographic designation that sits in the middle of an ice-covered ocean approximately 4,261 meters above the seabed. We have submarines that have surfaced through its ice. We have satellites that image it continuously. We have research stations within a few hundred kilometers of it. We understand it. Here is what the evidence increasingly suggests. We understand the surface of it. What sits below the ice, below the ocean floor, beneath the ice, in the acoustic and electromagnetic and geological behavior of the region, is not fully understood. And the gap between those two things, between what we are told we know and what the technical literature quietly acknowledges we don't, is wider than any map of the Arctic will show you. I need to ask a question that sounds obvious until you actually try to answer it. Why? Why, specifically, is the Arctic the site of the most active ongoing territorial dispute on the planet? The standard answer is resources. Oil, natural gas, shipping routes as the ice retreats, fisheries. These are real. I'm not dismissing them. But here is what the resource explanation consistently fails to account for. The specific coordinates being contested are not the resource-rich coordinates. The Lomonosov Ridge, the underwater mountain range that Russia formally submitted to the United Nations in 2001 as the basis for their expanded Arctic claim, as the geological extension of their continental shelf, does not sit over the richest hydrocarbon deposits. Those are in the relatively shallow, relatively accessible waters much closer to the coastlines. The Lomonosov Ridge runs directly under the geographic North Pole. Russia is spending extraordinary diplomatic and scientific capital to claim the seabed beneath 90 degrees north. Canada and Denmark are disputing that claim. And they are doing so not over the oil fields, not over the shipping lanes, but over the exact same underwater ridge running beneath the exact same coordinates. 3 major nations, all pointing at the same point on the map, the point with no obvious resource justification for the intensity of the dispute. There's a secondary detail here I want you to sit with. The Arctic Council, the intergovernmental body that governs cooperation in the Arctic, operates under an observer system. 13 non-Arctic nations have observer status: China, India, Japan, South Korea, the European Union. Each of these observers has invested significantly in Arctic research infrastructure. Each of them has stationed personnel and equipment in the region at considerable cost. None of them have a credible claim to Arctic resources that justifies that investment at current commodity prices. They are all watching. They are all present. They are all spending resources to remain close to that specific set of coordinates. I'm not telling you there's something under the North Pole. I'm telling you that every major power on the planet is behaving as if there might be. Let me tell you about the magnetic North Pole, not the geographic North Pole. They are different. The geographic pole is a fixed coordinate defined by the Earth's rotational axis. The magnetic pole is where compasses actually point, and it moves. For most of recorded history, it moved slowly. Documented drift of approximately 10 to 15 kilometers per year throughout the 19th and early 20th century. Predictable, stable, cartographically manageable. In the 1990s, that rate began to increase. By the early 2000s, it was moving at 55 kilometers per year. It is currently accelerating. The magnetic North Pole has moved more in the last 30 years than in the preceding century. It is crossing the Arctic Ocean. It is heading for Siberia. This is documented. This is in the literature. This is not contested. What is not being discussed with anything resembling the urgency you'd expect is why. The standard explanation involves shifts in the flow of liquid iron in the Earth's outer core, changes in convection patterns deep beneath the surface. Plausible. I accept it as a framework. But here's where the framework becomes uncomfortable. The models that predict core convection changes don't predict movement at this rate. The acceleration of the magnetic pole's drift is, in the language of the geophysicists who track it, anomalous relative to historical baselines. That word again. Anomalous. And the trajectory, if you map it, if you draw the path the magnetic pole has taken across the last century and extend it forward, points toward a convergence. The geographic pole and the magnetic pole, for the first time in the historical record, are drawing toward one another. Two poles, one coordinate. And we do not, in any mainstream scientific publication, I have been able to locate, ask what that convergence means for the anomalies that have been documented at those coordinates for the last 100 years. I want to go further back, before the satellites, before the airships, before the great contested expeditions of the early 20th century, to something that the history of polar exploration mentions and then consistently refuses to examine seriously. Throughout the 19th century, the dominant scientific and geographical belief about the Arctic was not that the pole was covered in ice. It was that beyond a certain latitude, beyond the ice barrier that explorers repeatedly encountered and struggled to cross, there was open water, the open polar sea. This was not fringe theory. This was taught at universities, published in geographic journals, debated in the Royal Geographical Society. The American geographer Matthew Maury, one of the most respected scientists of his era, argued in 1856 that the polar ice was a ring phenomenon, that warm currents from below maintained an ice-free ocean at the pole itself. Multiple expeditions set out specifically to find this open water. Several of them reported finding it. Elisha Kane in 1854, Isaac Hayes in 1860. Both American explorers, both reported encountering open water beyond the ice barrier. Both documented their observations carefully. Hayes in particular described what he called a wide, open, rolling sea with not a particle of ice visible in any direction. The official modern explanation for these reports is that the explorers were deceived. Mirages, Polynea's seasonal open water leads in the ice pack misinterpreted through wishful thinking and the distorting optics of Arctic conditions. I accept this explanation for some of the reports, but all of them? Hayes was an experienced physician and naturalist. Kane had already made one Arctic expedition. These are not men who cannot distinguish open ocean from a temporary ice lead. And here is what gets buried when you apply the mirage explanation universally. The 19th century explorers who reported open water consistently reported it at specific latitudes, not scattered randomly across the Arctic, clustered. Between 80 and 83 degrees north in certain longitudinal corridors that, when mapped, overlap with persistent anomaly zones in the modern satellite record. The open water may have been a mirage, or it may have been real and explainable by something that our current model of the Arctic doesn't account for. The scientific establishment chose the mirage explanation in the late 19th century. It has never, to my knowledge, formally reconsidered that choice in light of the modern anomaly data. I want to tell you about the expeditions, not the famous ones, the ones that didn't make the textbooks. The Canadian Arctic expedition, led by Vilhjalmur Stephenson. His scientific staff included geologists, oceanographers, a meteorologist. Standard expedition documentation, thorough, professional. His published reports are available. His field journals, the working documents from the expedition, are held in the Dartmouth College archives. In those journals, in an entry from August 1913 at approximately 77 degrees north, the expedition's physicist Dr. James Murray notes what he calls a persistent periodic fluctuation in barometric readings at a specific location. Fluctuations inconsistent with weather patterns, inconsistent with the diurnal pressure cycle, inconsistent with any natural phenomenon he could identify. He proposes several explanations. He returns to it 3 times over the following week. Then he stops. His final note on the subject reads simply, "I have decided to record no further observations on this matter until I have an explanation worth offering." He never offered one. The Soviet Union established a series of drifting ice stations in the Arctic beginning in 1937. Ice platforms, research facilities, manned and staffed for months at a time, drifting on the Arctic ice pack. The Soviets operated 31 of these stations between 1937 and 1991. Their data is only partially available in the West. What is available includes something I did not expect to find. Multiple Soviet station logs from the 1950s and 1960s document what their instrument operators called structured electromagnetic interference. Not the random noise you'd expect from the polar ionosphere. Structured, patterned, repeating at intervals described in several reports as too regular to be natural phenomena. The Soviet documentation attributes this to American experimental military equipment, ionospheric research installations, plausible for the era. Here is what's strange about that explanation. Several of the interference reports predate any American ionospheric research installation that was operational in the Arctic region by years, in one case by more than a decade. The explanation exists. The explanation doesn't fit the timeline. Nobody followed up. I need to tell you about the frequency. In 2003, a research team from the Alfred Wegener Institute for Polar and Marine Research was conducting an acoustic survey of the Arctic Ocean basin, standard oceanographic work. They were mapping sound propagation patterns at depth, measuring how sound travels through Arctic waters, relevant to submarine detection and climate research both. Their instrumentation documented a persistent sub-bass frequency emanating from a location they could not pinpoint precisely, but which their triangulation placed somewhere in the deep basin north of 85 degrees north latitude. The frequency was 18.98 Hz. I want you to hold that number. 18.98 Hz is below the threshold of human hearing. You cannot hear it. But it is within the range that the human body detects through means other than the ear. Research on infrasound on low-frequency acoustic phenomena below 20 Hz, has documented a specific cluster of effects associated with exposure: a sense of unease, a feeling of presence, spatial disorientation, mild visual disturbance at the periphery of vision. 18.98 Hz is almost exactly the resonant frequency of the human eye. It is the frequency at which the human eyeball begins to vibrate in response to external acoustic stimulation. It is the frequency that acoustic researchers studying anomalous visual phenomena have identified as the most plausible explanation for certain reported experiences of peripheral visual disturbance, of seeing things that aren't there. The Alfred Wegener team documented it. They attributed it to possible geological activity, a microseismic source, a deep-water current interaction, plausible hypotheses. They moved on. Their paper appears in the Journal of the Acoustical Society of America. The frequency measurement appears in the technical appendix. It is not discussed in the paper's conclusion. Here is the detail that stopped me cold. The infrasound zones documented in specific regions of the Amazon basin, which I've examined in detail elsewhere, cluster around frequencies of 18 to 19 Hz. The resonant acoustic profiles of the great medieval cathedrals, the ones that acoustic engineers have established were deliberately engineered, not accidentally produced, cluster around the same range. The persistent low-frequency phenomenon documented at Göbekli Tepe by the research team that published their findings in 2019 clusters at 18.5 Hz. A persistent frequency in the Arctic Deep Basin at 18.98 Hz. Documented once. Not followed up. Filed. Present in the technical literature and absent from the conversation. Why those specific coordinates? Why that specific frequency? The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. When I began examining the Arctic anomalies in isolation, the equipment failures, the territorial disputes, the electromagnetic irregularities, the acoustic observations noted, and then quietly set aside, I was treating them as a collection of separate incidents. Then I mapped them against documented anomalies elsewhere. The infrasound zones of the Amazon basin, equipment failures in specific corridors of Central Asia, the acoustic profiles of the Angkor complex, the magnetic anomalies reported in the Peruvian Andes at altitudes above 4,000 meters, the satellite data irregularities in the Australian interior at coordinates that overlap with the oldest continuous rock art sites on the continent. Something emerged from that mapping, not a clean diagram, not proof of anything, a suggestion, a directional suggestion. The anomaly clusters I have been tracking are not randomly distributed, they are not evenly distributed, they concentrate at what a planetary geophysicist would call nodes, points where specific intersections of geological, electromagnetic and acoustic properties converge. The North Pole is, by definition, the most extreme node on the planet, the point at which the Earth's rotational axis meets its surface, the point at which every line of longitude converges, the point at which the geometry of the planet is most concentrated. If there is something that operates through planetary geometry, if the Amazon earthwork builders were doing what the astronomical alignments suggest they were doing, if there is a system of some kind encoded in the relationship between specific Earth coordinates and specific sky configurations, then whatever that system does, it would do it loudest at 90 degrees north. I don't know if that is what is happening. I want to be clear about that. But I notice that nobody is asking. I want to talk about what the satellites see, or rather, what they don't. Synthetic aperture radar imaging of the Arctic has been operational since the early 1980s. We have 4 decades of continuous satellite observation of the polar region. The data is used for ice mapping, navigation routing, climate research. It is substantial. In the technical literature, in the sensor calibration documents and anomaly reports that sit in the footnotes of footnotes, there are consistent references to a zone of persistent data irregularity in the deep Arctic basin. A zone centered on approximately 87 to 90 degrees north latitude, where satellite radar returns contain what the processing documentation calls non-physical values, values that cannot be produced by any known combination of ice surface conditions, atmospheric interference, or instrument error. The 1987 NASA reports note it. The 1995 calibration documentation notes it. A 2007 sensor comparison study notes it in passing. A 2019 technical assessment of Arctic satellite coverage notes it with slightly more specificity, recommending that data from those coordinates be flagged for independent review before use in models. Flagged, not explained. Flagged. We have more powerful sensors now than in 1987, better processing algorithms, decades of accumulated calibration data. The anomaly has not resolved. Different satellites, different sensor generations, different imaging technologies, the same coordinates, the same irregular returns. Something at the North Pole is behaving in a way that our instruments cannot cleanly process. That statement is in the literature. It has simply never been stated as plainly as I just stated it. The silence around the North Pole is not the silence of a place that has been understood and filed away. I've read enough expedition accounts and technical assessments to recognize the pattern. A researcher encounters an anomaly, documents it, proposes a conventional explanation, often tentatively, moves on. The next researcher encounters the same anomaly, notes the prior documentation, proposes a slightly different conventional explanation, moves on. The observations accumulate, the explanations multiply. The anomaly itself is never resolved, never incorporated into a revised understanding of the place. It is not dismissed. Dismissal leaves a trace. Dismissal generates debate, counter-argument, the paper trail of scientific engagement. What happens to the Arctic anomalies is different. They are received with polite interest and absorbed. The bureaucracy of indifference is more complete than any active suppression could be. The specific observations that go unremarked, that get noted once and not followed up, that appear in technical appendices and not in main papers, those observations cluster around a specific question. Not what is there. That question gets asked superficially. But what is it doing? That question does not get asked. I want to close with something that has been sitting at the back of this story since I started it. The indigenous peoples of the Arctic, the Inuit and their related cultures, across the circumpolar north, have lived adjacent to the pole for longer than any written record extends. Their knowledge of the Arctic environment is practical, navigational, accumulated over generations of survival in lethal conditions. It is also, by any honest assessment, more detailed about local Arctic phenomena than any external scientific survey has managed to be. In the ethnographic literature, in the accounts collected across the 19th and early 20th century, there are consistent descriptions of a place near the axis of the sky. Not the geographic pole necessarily, but a directional point described not merely as north, but as a place of origin, a location where the lights come from, where the sounds travel that move under the ice, where certain forces are different from everywhere else. The Inuit did not need instruments to know that something at that end of the world behaves differently. They described it, they mapped it in their oral traditions. They declined in many accounts to approach it directly. The reasons given in the ethnographic record are not the reasons of fear in the ordinary sense. They are the reasons of protocol. The reasons you don't enter a place whose function you don't fully understand. The scientific tradition that followed them into the Arctic brought instruments, and the instruments found the same thing. A persistent anomaly at the top of the world, a frequency, coordinates where the data doesn't behave, territorial claims clustering around a point with no obvious strategic value, expedition logs that note something and then stop noting it. The magnetic pole is moving. Every model we have suggests that its current trajectory will bring it significantly closer to the geographic pole within the next several decades than it has been in recorded history. Two poles converging. The rotational axis and the magnetic axis drawing together toward a single coordinate. The geophysical literature addresses what happens when they meet. Magnetic field behavior, navigation corrections, compass calibration adjustments. It does not address what happens at 18.98 Hz when both poles occupy the same location. It does not address what the satellites will return from those coordinates when the anomalous imaging zone and the magnetic anomaly zone overlap completely. It does not ask how long the frequency has been there before we arrived to measure it, or what was producing it before we had instruments capable of detecting it. The North Pole is not restricted because of oil. It is not contested by 5 nations because of shipping lanes. It is not the site of 40 years of unresolved satellite irregularities because of instrument error that somehow resists 4 decades of improving technology. I don't know what it is. I want to be honest about that. What I know is this. 3 major nations are spending enormous resources to own the seabed beneath 90 degrees north. A persistent frequency has been documented there that the literature files and does not examine. Satellite data from those coordinates has been flagged as irregular since 1987 without resolution. Expedition accounts going back a century describe equipment behavior that the standard compass explanation does not fully account for. Soviet research from the mid-20th century documents structured interference that predates the technology it was attributed to, and the people who have lived nearest to this place for the longest time described it consistently as a location where something originates. The magnetic pole is pointing somewhere. It has been pointing somewhere more urgently with each passing decade. It is moving at a rate that our models called impossible 20 years ago and have since quietly revised. And whatever it is pointing toward has been there longer than our measurements, longer than our expeditions, longer than the territorial claims that have been quietly, expensively, persistently staked around it. We have not asked, not really, not fully, what it is that we are all, without quite admitting it, pointing at,